So, one of the things that we can compare between those civilizations that developed in Mesoamerica and those tribes that developed here in the northern part of America is the fact that these large civilizations like the Incas and the Aztecs and the Mayas were these huge empires. And in the North American region, you find that the tribes, if you refer back to the thing link and you saw all the different culture sections, these tribes were smaller groups. They were very kind of independent from each other. They didn't create these large empires that we saw throughout Meso and South America. So that's a distinct difference between the Native Americans that lived in North America to those that were in Meso and South America. One exception to that is this alliance that formed in the Northeast that's known as the Iroquois League, right? And the Iroquois League was made up of a group of tribes that lived in the Northeast area, mostly very similar tribes of Iroquois and Algonquin Native Americans who joined together and kind of created an alliance in which they kind of called a peace and a truce to work together, and therefore they could confront their enemies together and become a very powerful group within the Northeast. And it's one of the reasons why the Iroquois were able to survive so long against the Europeans. When the Europeans arrive in the Americas, the Iroquois become allies with them eventually, but they are looked at as a very strong tribe or strong league of tribes because of the fact that they have this alliance that was very unique in comparison to the other tribes throughout North America, where that wasn't really very common. So the Iroquois League originally was made up of 5 tribes of the Northeast: the Cayuga, the Onondaga, the Seneca, the Mohawk, the Oneida. And eventually a 6th tribe joined, the Tuscarora, but not until the 1700s do they join in. And the Iroquois League came together under what was known as the Great Law of Peace, which is the alliance that officially joined these tribes together. And with that Great Law of Peace, they created a Grand Council who was then in charge of settling any disputes that may have occurred between the tribes. So this Iroquois League definitely was very important within this northeast portion of the United States, and they're going to play a big role in the interaction between the Native Americans and the Europeans when they start to arrive here in the eastern part of the United States. Now, another little mnemonic device to kind of remember the original 5 tribes of the Iroquois League is just to remember the word Cosmo, and each letter stands for one of those 5 tribes, right? The Cayuga, the Onondaga, the Seneca, the Mohawk, and the Oneida. So that's just one more of these little tips and tricks to kind of remember these different tribes. Now, despite the fact that each of these Native American tribes are very independent from one another, right? And depending on the region that they lived in the United States, they had very different types of cultural traits, foods, different types of homes. But one of the things that they did have were some kind of shared beliefs. Despite the different tribes, there were shared beliefs among all of the Native Americans. One of them having to deal with religious beliefs. We did find very similar religious beliefs from tribe to tribe across the country. Most of their religious beliefs were linked to nature, right? They felt that nature was very sacred. So spiritual forces were considered to be everywhere within plants and animals. And so they were very respectful to the world and the environment around them. And one of the other shared beliefs they had was the beliefs about property and owning property and what that meant to the Native American, which was very different than the beliefs you might have found in other areas, especially in Europe, where property was really considered something that man could own land that was considered property, and it could be divided up among people, and people can be prevented from going from place to place. Native Americans didn't really see property that way, right? They thought that land itself, the earth, was not something that man could own. Ownership could only apply to the crops that you grow on the earth, that those crops are yours because you planted them. But the land itself, the whole entire world, that's not man's. right? That was there before them. So they couldn't really own that land. They didn't understand that concept of land ownership. That wasn't part of the Native American belief. Land was used by everyone in the village, and everyone in the village could use the land. And they believed in preserving the land for future generations. They believed that the land was sacred and it's something that needed to be taken care of so that the rest of the village could survive and the future generations of the village could survive. So ownership really only applied to those tangible things that you made or created yourself. But something like land could not be owned by man. And if we think about our beliefs of property today that are linked with the European belief overall, it's a very different concept of ownership about property, which is not difficult to understand why the Native Americans and the Europeans, when they came into contact with each other, there was a lot of conflict there because they really didn't understand each other. Their core beliefs were very different from one another culturally. So this has been just a little bit of overview over the Iroquois League and the shared beliefs that we find throughout the rest of the Native American tribes in North America. So now you can go ahead and start to answer those review questions. So hope you were listening.